Hi, we're coming to you live from Washington, D.C. I'm Raj Kumar. I'm the president and editor-in-chief of DevX. We're here at the World Bank annual meetings. This has been a series of Facebook Lives that we're doing all around the big picture theme of ending poverty. And this place is a buzz. There are people from all over the world, 10,000 people from every walk of life you can imagine here in Washington, D.C. to talk about this big issue. And we've got an ideal person to continue this discussion, and Achim Steiner, who is, of course, the head of UNDP, the United Nations Development Program. Your job at the UN is to think about ending poverty and reaching that goal by 2030. And so we're going to get into that. And in particular, we want to talk today about how to prevent violent extremism. I want to let the audience know who's following us on Facebook right now, we'd love your questions. Please submit them. We'll try to get to as many as we can. And just to say, before we get into this report, which is fascinating, by the way, it's this report that your organization has done, interviewing people who are in ISIS, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, people are involved in these movements or have gotten out of them. A really fascinating, groundbreaking report. Before we get there, I just want to ask you why we're talking violent extremism. Because some people following this might say, okay, you're the poverty guy at the UN. You used to be the head of the UN Environment Program. You're also the climate and environment guy. You're not the terrorism guy. How does this connect to the end poverty agenda?
Basically, when we are at these annual meetings, when we look at the world at large, we usually tend to objectify things. We start aggregating data, we start describing trends. What we try and do with this report is to go back to the individual. How does an individual end up from being a 16-year-old son of a proud family and become a violent extremist, a terrorist in just 2 years? And to understand that not as some phenomenon of just psychological misguided behavior, but really as a product of where this family lives, where people are radicalized, and to understand that at the end of the day, what the evidence is showing us is that very often radicalization, marginalization is inextricably linked to poverty, a sense of being excluded or left behind, and therefore extremism becomes an attractive option, particularly when it is manipulated through movements that lure you into their movements. And at its simplest, extremism is very often the breeding ground that a development failure creates, and on which we can then see people out of desperation, or as many of them have said, also out of a yearning to belong to something better than the desperation in their community, they become radicalized. And extremism is something that is preoccupying our societies worldwide. This is not only a phenomenon in developing countries, as we know, polarization, radicalization, inequality of incomes. This is all part of a story about young people who, at that stage in their life are most idealistic, are dreaming about the future, want to do something for their community, and then often find themselves to be victims of poverty, of often a reaction by the state towards extremism, and become victims of that development failure.
And so it is a development issue. When you think about the 2030 agenda, right, these global goals have been set out, and the first one is to end poverty. Do we need to end violent extremism to end poverty? Is it that closely connected, or is it sort of a marginal issue in the end that doesn't actually affect that many people, even though it does generate all the headlines and is obviously very emotionally important to all of us?
Well, first of all, let's be honest, violent extremism at the moment is not a phenomenon that's restricted to a few countries. It's permeating our daily lives across the globe, and not just in the high-profile terrorist attacks that we see in some of the larger nations around the world, the capital cities. In fact, the African continent just in the last 5 to 6 years has lost 33,000 lives to extremism and attacks of that nature. It's turning on the community itself, which is one reason why UNDP found itself invited by many countries to help them understand this phenomenon and to put measures in place that would address this phenomenon, not from a military armed securitized response, because that is, yes, a reaction when it's almost too late already. The question is, can we invest in a development path that begins to address the drivers of this alienation that ultimately can be the breeding ground for extremism?
So let's think about that a little, because the report is fascinating. As I said, some 495 people were interviewed who voluntarily joined one of these extremist movements. And we're talking the ones that people are very familiar with: Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, ISIS. And these are people who are now maybe in jail, or have left the movement, or in some other way were contacted by the people who are writing this report and interviewed in a really in-depth way. I mean, it's fascinating, the questions about their home life when they were kids and their view of religion and culture. Questions like, did they sing the national anthem when they were a child? I mean, really in-depth psychographic, psychometric kinds of questions. What did you learn from this? What sort of surprising takeaways did you get?
Well, as you know, when an attack happens, it's very easy to demonize the attacker, and it is a reflex that I think everybody naturally shares. But if we want to address the reasons why people who just a few years ago were young boys or girls in a family, right, the idealized image of the next generation, we need to understand how do people get from A to B, and B in this case not being the vast majority, but an ever-growing number of people. And that is why going through these individual life stories, but on a scale that is sufficiently representative, was part of this project. And it took us 2 years to find these people, many of them now either locked up in jail or having been rehabilitated in their communities, who were willing to describe that journey to extremism, as the name of the report says. And that journey often begins not as simply as people think. It may be that, yes, it's a poor community, but what may have happened, and that was one of the interesting findings, is that in 70% of the stories that we found and captured, the tipping point for somebody to actually leave their community and join an extremist movement was actually as a result of government action. Now, here's an interesting phenomenon. Often that is already part of a military and security response to extremism, to protest, and what in the military terminology is often called collateral damage is my experience of this military response: killing my father, having my mother or sister raped, or my friend shot. And those are, in 3/4 of the cases, the tipping points that actually led people to move into those movements. Another very interesting finding in the report is, yes, religion can be something that motivates you to join. And at the same time, what the interviews tell us is that the more people attended religious education, the less likely they were actually to join these extremist movements. So yes, extremism feeds on religion as an idealized motivation, but most of the people that we interviewed actually were people who joined within a month of being contacted by people. So it is not the madrasas in the long term that teach Islam or church schools that radicalize people. It's actually the use of religion, the manipulation of religion, and people are very susceptible to it.
Finding people who are vulnerable. And there's an interesting chart in the report about the extent to which people feel they can even understand the Quran alone, or need to have someone interpret it for them. And many of these people say, I need someone to help me interpret it, and it's in that interpretation that this version, this incorrect view of the religion is put into their heads.
Absolutely. And again, the report is so interesting because it reveals things that we may not assume to be self-evident. For instance, we think that the internet is the obvious recruitment ground for extremism. Not in Africa. It's actually through local contacts, which kind of makes it very obvious that if we want to counter this extremism and this manipulation of youth in particular, then we have to work with local leaders. They are the first front line of engaging with youth, not to persuade them in one direction or another, but simply to give them an opportunity to discuss their situation, to realize that joining such a movement is not the only answer, but to engage in their community and to start tackling some of the underlying causes. And that is also why we take this report now to governments across the continent, but also in many of the international capitals, because what we want to demonstrate is that if we want to tackle extremism, we have to understand that more often than not, it is the product of a failure in development, and therefore the response must be also rooted in a developmental approach to it.
One important caveat to that, I think, early on in the discussion around violent extremism, there was this idea that was out there that it's about poverty. But it's not just lack of income. In fact, you have in your report, there are many people who are employed, who have a job, who might get engaged in a violent extremist group. It's also social injustice or social marginalization. As you said, a government action, maybe killing a friend. Talk to us a bit more about that. It's not just the people at the bottom of the income scale that this affects, right?
No, as we know from major terrorist attacks, sometimes those who lead those attacks are not at all from the poorest communities, but it is more on the continent of Africa, the mass of fighters that are being sent out, whether by Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab, that are, first of all, easily recruitable because they have very little to draw on. Secondly, what we, in a sense, also see is that the ability to attract these people is in part rooted in a sense of hopelessness. And I think we often forget that whether you are a young Somali kid with virtually nothing but a roof over your head maybe and food for the next week at your disposal, or whether you are sitting here in Washington, D.C. as a teenager, your hopes, your aspirations, your dreams, your love of your father, of your mother, being embedded in a community, this is all part of what shapes your identity. Many of these communities are disturbed by conflict, by extreme weather events, the droughts, the floods.
Right.
They are dislocated communities. They've often lost their parents. All of this adds to a sense of isolation and desperation. It's very human, which is not in any way to rationalize it or to excuse it. It's to understand what the drivers are, because only then can we respond with more than guns and counterattacks, which we know in the end rarely will win the battle against extremism.
Right. There was an entire category of people interviewed in the report that was a sort of a surprise to me, which was people who are forced to join these violent extremist groups. It's an important thing to keep in mind as well. There are people who are part of this who didn't want to be a part of it, but got pulled in, especially groups like Boko Haram.
Absolutely. I mean, the tragedy of child soldiers is one that we have known for many years. Unfortunately, the extremist movements have copied it and have made it part of their strategy of both growing the numbers and of being able to, within a year or 2 years, turn a very innocent 14, 15-year-old into a lethal weapon. It's tragic. It's tragic in human terms. It's tragic in terms of the manipulation, the cynicism. But above all, it's tragic in terms of what happens to those communities, and because their very own children become weapons against them.
And we're starting to get some questions in from our audience online. And one of the people was asking us, how does UNDP sort of fit into this? So you've now commissioned this incredible report. You've started to absorb the results. What do you do differently now as a new leader of this organization?
Well, first of all, the report itself was born out of a program that we started 2 years ago in 2015 at the request of governments across the continent who were saying, come and help us understand how we can intervene in this. What can we do to address the drivers of extremism in our borders, in our communities? And so, first of all, data and analysis is one of the foundations for making better decisions. And the report took 2 years because we actually had to find these people, make sure that they were willing to talk about their stories and put this together. And I think it's become a powerful piece to trigger rethinking strategy. And already I'm aware that in a number of capitals, including in military circles, this report is being read because it is a wake-up call.
I can imagine.
Secondly, we have started a number of programs that are revisiting development initiatives and interventions. For instance, classic development theory would say invest where the return is greatest. Go to the urban areas, go to the growth points in an economy. What the report and in a sense evidence from others also shows is that very often radicalization, marginalization happens in remote areas, in the border areas. It's where terrorist movements are most easily able to cross borders unnoticed, recruit people, take them across the boundary and then train them. That's also the community that very often is the last one to receive either support, infrastructure, educational infrastructure, health services, and therefore the sense of injustice and being left behind is very astute and acute. And that's why the report now, first of all, allows us as a development program to be of greater assistance to countries who are saying, how do we address this risk? Secondly, what kinds of interventions can we put in place? And also to help the donor community understand that in, for instance, the Sahel region, yes, there is a significant need right now for military and security support because so much of the battle has already been lost. But at the end of the day, we have to realize that this battle cannot be won with weapons. It actually is about making life more worthwhile, fairer, giving people a sense of hope, particularly young people. And at the moment, the reality in our world is that we spend, for every dollar that we put into aid, we spend $12 on the military. Yep. So this is our investment proposition. And I think this report is in some ways also a challenge to this cost-benefit analysis. Can you demonstrate the return on investment that this ratio at the moment seems to portray?
All right, it's a great question, and I think many people in the development community, certainly our audience at DevEx, feel strongly that the balance is certainly in the wrong direction. I wonder if you could give us an example of the kind of project UNDP would do, let's say in a rural area, in a marginalized area, a border region, that might help to address some of the kinds of root causes that are reported about here.
Well, as I mentioned, first of all, allow government to understand who are these communities, what is their greatest need, and how do we actually reach them. Mm-hmm. This is part of the Sustainable Development Goals principles of leave no one behind, and particularly look for those left furthest behind. Right. And that leads us automatically to some of these communities. Now, we are in the process of developing projects with countries right now. Some of them have to do, for example, with working with religious teaching institutions. In a number of countries, we are now working with madrasas and imams and religious leaders to look at the curricula at madrasas and see whether there are lessons to be learned on how madrasas can be a place where religion becomes something that produces enlightenment, self-reflection, rather than a hiding ground perhaps for those who want to manipulate these institutions for recruitment. We're also looking at the issue of education, and education from the point of view that it's not just to educate you and then leave you stuck in no man's land. Education must lead to something. Hopeful opportunities must arise from that. So can we in these remote areas begin to trigger development opportunities, livelihood opportunities that give people a chance? Thirdly, it has to do also with local leadership. I think very often government has neglected traditional leaders because in the modern administrative structure, we work in a cascade. There's federal government, there's subnational governments, there's municipalities or districts. But actually the people who in a community can recognize where maybe alienation is beginning, where injustice is taking place, are actually the wise leaders of a community. Do we know how to work with them in the development process? No, very often we've overlooked them. So these are just a couple of examples. And then going right through to, the classic infrastructure for development, access to energy. The renewable energy revolution that's now unfolding across the globe is particularly relevant to Africa because access to energy is still something that is denied to almost 3/4 of Africa's citizens today. Now, with the off-grid technologies that solar and wind offer to us, we can actually create access to energy and electricity in the most remote areas without having to wait another 10 or 15 years for the power lines to reach them. So these are shortcuts to progress. This is why access to energy is at the same time something that can help us with clean energy to address emissions. It can help us to address remote areas that have no access to electricity today. It can empower communities. And yes, it can contribute to prevention of extremism.
So let's talk about the broader remit of the UN Development Program, the organization you lead. We're here at the annual meetings. There's an alphabet soup of 8 agencies. What is the unique value proposition of the United Nations Development Program?
Well, since the 60s when it was established, it is the UN's development program. It means it is there to assist governments and nations to address the whole spectrum of development challenges and choices. And sometimes in the past, for instance, in the case of Singapore, UNDP was invited in the 50s to provide a report on opportunities for Singapore's modernization. The years that followed, that initial report became the blueprint of the first development plans. And in fact, Singapore became the country with the highest per capita deployment UNDP resources. So that's one trajectory. We advise governments on choices and options for development. Now, since 2015, the Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, have become the central reference point for UNDP also. Our task is to help governments look at how do we achieve development that does not trade off economic progress against social equity or environmental sustainability. The 17 goals are complex. They're a challenge to government in terms of reaching their citizens. So this can be either at the level of planning, with ministries of planning and finance, or it can be through pilot programs. And it can be in helping governments also develop their response strategies to something like, for instance, climate change. The nationally determined contributions that each country brought to the Paris Agreement benefited a great deal also from the technical advice and support of UNDP, of UNEP and other organizations in the UN system who helped to allow countries to have a clear idea of how they could commit to the Paris Agreement. And I think at the heart of our work today lies the empowerment of communities and nations under a development paradigm that no longer thinks that it can pursue economic development at the expense of leaving too many people behind, and that it has to happen in the context of a planetary reality. We live on planet Earth, not cornucopia, and we are learning some very bitter lessons. And perhaps the greatest challenge for us is to demonstrate that if you were to take these SDGs, you can first of all begin to create win-win opportunities. We talk about gender, health, climate change, always in separate categories. If you take pollution and you can reduce pollution, women and children are particularly affected by it. If you can manage to do that, you improve not only health, but actually gender equity. The new jobs and markets of the future that are emerging on the back of the SDGs, which in some ways are focused on the problems of today, but turning them into solutions, also explain why we have managed in perhaps less than 15 years to move from a renewable energy economy that was a few $1 million in the global economy to today over $300 billion in an annual investment.
Right.
We have an energy revolution underway.
It's happening.
And it is as much about climate change and CO2 emissions as it is about clean energy and pollution, as it is about access to energy. And lo and behold, it's getting so cheap. Maybe for once, the electricity industry will actually have to ask itself, how can we meter this if it is almost free?
Right, you're right. I think we've got viewers from all over the world watching us right now, from Brazil, from Tunisia, from Senegal. Thank you for being a part of this.
Mucho
Canada,
bon dia.
Egypt. So let me. It was one of the questions we got was very basic, but what is the budget of UNDP? How big are you?
Last year, the budget was roughly $4.9 billion, $5 billion, which sounds a lot of money, is a lot of money, and yet we should look at it from the context of what the institution is meant to do. UNDP today works in 170 countries around the world. That means we work probably with 4/5 of humanity in one form or another. We are, however, in some places, particularly in Asia, for instance, not funded to work very well with all the countries in the region. We are particularly in crisis countries at the moment, being asked by the international community, by those governments to assist with stabilization measures. So sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars are simply having to be expended on the back of a fantastically catastrophic crisis. Take Iraq at the moment, the liberation of Mosul. UNDP is at the moment at the request of the Iraqi government implementing a stabilization program there that is trying to help the million people who have been displaced just in Mosul to reconnect electricity, water, schools, put a roof over health centers, move the rubble out of the way so that even the most basic reason to return to the city and start life again can happen. On the other hand, in many parts of the world, we can hardly maintain our program because the funding is so thin that UNDP's ability to really serve countries is compromised. So, as I say, $5 billion sounds a lot of money.
In context, it may not be.
Put it in context and put it across the mission of what we do, then it is, I think, something that I also speak to many donor countries at the moment to explain to them what is actually the benefit of having a multilateral UN agency be a leader on the development front, and what is the value to us. And a simple proposition is if a country like the UK or Germany puts in 10, 20, $30 million, it is actually leveraging the contribution of another $4.95 billion from the rest of the world. And that is one of the great multiplier values of working through multilateral systems. And very often we are the first ones to arrive in a crisis or the last ones to leave. This is something we should also remember. And people often forget that as you and I sit here today, there are literally 20 million people who are able to eat this evening somewhere around the world because of the work that the World Food Programme, that UNICEF does. There are children who are alive because the WHO has actually ensured that vaccines in refugee camps are available. Or the peacekeepers who, in many of the most extreme locations at the moment, getting shot at, getting killed, are protecting civilians and citizens, literally in their millions. So multilateralism is something that, is often judged at the moment in very harsh terms. Yeah. And I wish that sometimes people could actually see how many thousands of my colleagues every day are actually risking their lives on the front lines of conflict, natural disasters. And yes, at the same time, we, like any other institution, have our moments of failure, where we take risks and we misjudge things, or just human failure, corruption.
Sure.
This is the spectrum with it, judging an institution, its value, I think today has to happen.
Well, and as we wrap up, the environment has changed a lot. You referred to this, but we're in a moment of humanitarian disaster that's unprecedented for decades and decades. And it's very likely, given climate change, given the conflicts we're talking about, the extremists that are out there, that this may continue. We may see larger numbers of people displaced. Humanitarian crisis may expand. The development challenges, we've had a lot of success in some countries where there was great progress, the Chinas and Indias and Brazils of the world, but there are many other countries that are kind of left behind. So as you think of that new reality, I know that the Secretary General, someone you work closely with, Antonio Guterres, is thinking about how to reform the institution for the future, for the new realities we're in. Much bigger challenges, limited resources to a degree, some countries skeptical of the multilateral system, you referred to that, new technologies, a new world where national governments aren't the only players anymore, right? And private sector is much more important in the equation. So you're a big part of that. You're thinking about how to reform your agency as well. What does UNDP look like a year from now or 2 years from now? What's going to be different as you get into this reform and make some substantial changes there as the leader?
I prefer a notion of evolution, because I think a lot of what we are doing right now is what countries have asked us to do, and therefore it is not wrong. But at the same time, as you say, the world is changing very rapidly. And I think to all those who are listening today, I think it is a moment of sitting back and reflecting from it. We're entering an era in which the prospect of nuclear conflict has reappeared, where natural disasters, in a sense, caused by inaction on drivers such as climate change, will make the current number of people who are having to flee their place called home in ever larger numbers. I mean, the 65 million that we had in the last 1 or 2 years may soon become 100 million. And we can see how we can't cope with these flows of refugees and displaced people right now. Take infectious diseases. I mean, it's only about 24 months ago where we were looking at the prospect of having to shut down parts of our global economy because of an outbreak of an infectious disease. These are demonstrations of how countries cannot act in their own domain to solve these problems. We need one another. And that is the most fundamental principle that underpins multilateralism. It's what led to the Charter of the United Nations being written after the catastrophe of the Second World War. And peace is at the forefront of that vision. And then we look at also issues such as development. And I see the role of development in the context of this Sustainable Development Goals philosophy as fundamental to the premise of how can we live together with 8, 9, 10 billion people on this planet. We need to cooperate on solving problems. And UNDP has to evolve. The challenges that governments face today have also to do with, for instance, not only the examples I gave you of climate change or infectious diseases, but automation, the digital economy. It could be a tremendous opportunity. It could also be the beginning, with artificial intelligence on top of it, of a jobless growth decade. Right. So yes, the GDP indicator, which is so central to determining how our global economy does here at the annual meetings, may tell us nothing about the millions who have no jobs, even though the economy is growing. So employment strategies for that technology and science-informed decade that lies ahead of us is something that is as relevant to an African leader and governments at the moment as it is to the government of the United States or of Japan. We are, at the end of the day, and that is my vision, the world's knowledge resource on best practice in development, in choices that are rooted in a principled agenda, such as Agenda 2030, where leaving no one behind isn't just a prosaic commitment. It's a very down-to-earth pragmatic assessment that we have learned some bitter lessons. If we leave too many people behind, if inequality starts tearing our societies apart, if millions of people can no longer live in the places where they're used to live and grow their food or pursue their careers, but have to become refugees, we create dislocation, discord, and ultimately, yes, also the radicalization that leads so many people to say, this is not my system. Yeah. So development at the beginning of the 21st century, in my mind, is at the heart of the vision of the United Nations.
And it should be. And I, this report does, I think, advance your agenda of making your agency a real knowledge resource for the world. It is an incredible report. I recommend everyone to take a look at it. And you said something fascinating, especially for someone like myself in the media, which is
just hold it up.
There it is. And we'll put that out on Facebook. Yeah. Everybody should look at it. You talked about nuance. You talked about taking a step back. And I can tell you, we at DevX is something we try to do on some of these in-depth issues, because it's easy to write that quick headline. And there are, incidents every day, but it's important to think big about what we can do as one community. I think that's what these annual meetings are really all about. We actually do have the potential to end poverty by 2030. These goals are not just pie in the sky. They're not just fantasy. They can be done. And there are people like yourself and agencies like yours working hard at it. We'll keep doing our job, reporting on it, trying to find out what's working and what's not. And we really appreciate the involvement of all of you from all over the world being part of the discussion today and all the discussions we're here having at the annual meeting here in Washington, D.C. Thank you, Achim Steiner.
Thank you, Raj.
And we look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you.